The tension in the briefing room was thick enough to choke on. Admiral Richard Sterling smirked, dismissing the quiet woman in the corner as a mere secretary. He had no idea the secretary had more confirmed kinetic strikes than his entire strike group. He was about to learn a brutal lesson. The fog rolling off the Pacific into Naval Amphibious Base Coronado brought a familiar, biting chill, but Evelyn Hayes didn't feel it. At 38, her body had long ago unlearned the sensation of cold, trained out of her during the grueling hypothermic nights of Bud's A380's Class 318. Evelyn wasn't just a Navy SEAL, she was the anomaly. The one the brass whispered about, the one who survived Hell Week carrying a Zodiac boat practically by herself when 3 of her boat crew rang the bell and quit. She had spent the last 15 years operating in the shadows with Death Grew SEAL Team, 6 earning scars in places like Yemen, Somalia, and the hostile mountain ridges of the Hindu Kush. But today she wasn't in tactical gear. She wore a simple Navy working uniform, her rank insignia completely obscured by a black, unmarked Arcatrix fleece jacket. She carried a battered leather notebook and a thermos of black coffee, slipping quietly into the back of the Joint Intelligence Center. The room was already buzzing with high-stakes energy. At the center of the mahogany conference table stood Admiral Richard Sterling. Sterling was a 2-star admiral who looked exactly like a recruiting poster. Silver hair perfectly parted, jawline like an anvil, and a chest full of ribbons that shone under the fluorescent lights. But within the tight-knit special warfare community, Sterling was known as a hallway admiral. He had commanded a SEAL team over 2 decades ago during peacetime. But he had earned his stars by shaking the right hands in Washington, navigating the Pentagon's political labyrinth rather than dodging bullets downrange. He was arrogant, old school, and deeply resentful of the changing face of the modern military. Surrounding Sterling was his usual entourage of sycophants, most notably Commander Thomas Gregson, a staff officer who nodded at everything the Admiral said. They were reviewing satellite imagery projected onto the massive digital screens dominating the front wall. Evelyn found the empty chair near the corner, pulled it out, and sat down. She opened her notebook. Sterling glanced up from the digital map, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Evelyn. He paused, his brow furrowing. He didn't recognize her face, which wasn't surprising. Evelyn's personnel file was buried under so many levels of SAP special access program classifications that it essentially didn't exist. To Sterling, she just looked like an out-of-place junior officer or an administrative aide who had wandered into the wrong high-level briefing. "Excuse me," Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the room. He pointed a thick finger toward her. "The flag-level briefing is closed. If you're looking for the Public Affairs Coordination meeting, it's in Building 4. And on your way out, sweetheart, tell the yeoman we need fresh coffee up here." A few of the junior officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the blatant disrespect, but no one dared correct the 2-star admiral. Evelyn didn't blink. She didn't flush with embarrassment. She simply took a slow sip from her thermos, her eyes locked on Sterling's. The scar on her jaw, a souvenir from a close-quarters ambush in Fallujah, tightened slightly. "I'm not here for public affairs, Admiral," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, calm, but it carried an undeniable weight that commanded the room. "And the coffee in the mess hall is fresh enough. I'm here for the tactical breakdown of Operation Obsidian Tide." Sterling staffed, exchanging an amused, condescending look with Commander Gregson. "Obsidian Tide is a Tier 1 kinetic planning session. Nav Spequa only. I know the Pentagon is pushing hard for integration on the administrative side, but this is a warfighting brief. We are discussing a hostage rescue and maritime interdiction in hostile territory. I don't have the time or the crayons to explain the operational logistics to a staff secretary, so I will ask you politely one more time. Clear the room." Evelyn closed her notebook. She didn't leave. Instead, she stood up, walked right past the row of seated captains and commanders, and took the empty chair at the direct head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the senior tactical commander. A collective gasp, soft but audible, rippled through the room. Commander Gregson looked like he was about to faint. "I think I'll stay," Evelyn said, leaning back in the chair. "Please, Admiral, continue. I'm eager to hear how you plan to execute this." Sterling's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged. He opened his mouth to order the master-at-arms to drag her out, but the heavy steel doors of the briefing room hissed open. Secretary of the Navy David Kessler walked in, accompanied by 2 armed Marine guards. The room instantly snapped to attention. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. "As you were," Kessler said, waving a hand tiredly as he took a seat on the side of the table. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on Evelyn for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of recognition passing between them before he turned to Sterling. "Admiral, the President wants an actionable plan on his desk by 0800. We have 3 compromised CIA operatives being held by a rogue maritime militia in the Sulu Sea archipelago. Time is bleeding out. Give me the floor plan." Sterling, forced to swallow his rage, shot Evelyn a venomous glare that promised severe retribution the second the secretary left. But for now, he had a stage, and he loved an audience. "Mr. Porrater, Mr. Math." "Secretary," Sterling began, stepping up to the digital projection board and grabbing a laser pointer. His demeanor instantly transformed back to the confident, booming commander. "Operation Obsidian Tide. The target is a heavily fortified, decommissioned oil rig off the coast of Palawan, currently occupied by the Abu Sayyaf splinter group holding our operatives." Sterling clicked a button and the satellite image of a rust-covered maritime structure appeared on the screen. "Intelligence suggests a hostile force of roughly 40 to 50 lightly armed combatants. They are relying on the isolation of the sea for security," Sterling continued, his laser pointer circling the rig. "My plan is straightforward, overwhelming, and decisive. We bypass subtlety." Evelyn watched him, her face an unreadable mask, but internally she was already dissecting the glaring flaws in his assessment. "We launch a Marine Expeditionary Unit, MEU, from the USS Makin Island," Sterling said, puffing out his chest. "We fast-rope 2 platoons directly onto the helipad of the rig under the cover of darkness. Simultaneously, we send in a Devtraha element via stealth rigid-hull inflatable boats, RHEIBs, to scale the lower pylons and breach the sublevels. We catch them in a pincer movement, neutralize the hostiles, secure the package, and exfil via heavy-lift helos within 20 minutes. Sterling turned back to Secretary Kessler, beaming with self-satisfaction. "It's a textbook hammer and anvil strike. Fast, aggressive, and leave no room for the enemy to react." "Not. No. Sure. Oh!" Commander Gregson nodded enthusiastically. "A brilliant application of overwhelming force, Admiral." Kessler frowned slightly, rubbing his chin. "Are we sure about the likely armed assessment? And what about early warning systems?" "Satellite sweeps show no heavy anti-aircraft batteries or radar arrays." Sterling dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "They're pirates, Mr. Secretary. They have AK-47s and skiffs. When our boys drop out of the sky, they'll scatter like roaches." The room was silent, save for the hum of the service. Sterling looked incredibly pleased with himself. Then the quiet, calm voice cut through the air again. "If you execute that plan, Admiral," Evelyn said, not looking up as she scribbled a note in her battered leather book, "you will lose 2 full platoons of Marines, wipe out a Tier 1 element, and the hostages will be executed before your boots even hit the rusted steel of that deck." The silence in the room shattered. Heads snapped toward Evelyn. Sterling's jaw dropped in sheer disbelief at the audacity. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Sterling roared, slamming his palms flat onto the table, leaning aggressively toward her. "I am a 2-star Admiral. I commanded SEAL Team 4. I wrote the Doctrine on Maritime Interdiction. You will shut your mouth, stand at attention, and state your name and rank, so I can draw up the court-martial papers immediately. Knocked. Accept. Secretary Kessler didn't intervene. He just leaned back, watching Evelyn with a quiet, knowing interest. Evelyn didn't stand at attention. She didn't flinch. She picked up the laser pointer Sterling had left on the table, pointed it at the digital screen, and clicked. The image zoomed in on a blurry, pixelated shape on the eastern edge of the rig. "Your satellite intelligence is 4 days out of date, Admiral," Evelyn stated, her tone surgical and merciless. "You're relying on Enro passes that were taken before the monsoon cloud cover moved in. I know this because 3 days ago I was treading water 50 yards from that exact pylon on an advance force operations reconnaissance swim." The room froze. Sterling blinked, the color draining slightly from his face, though his anger remained. "What? That blurry shape you dismissed as debris?" Evelyn continued, the red laser dot holding perfectly still on the screen. "It's not debris. It's a hastily modified Russian P-18 early warning radar system. They aren't lightly armed pirates. They are backed by a state sponsor, highly organized and expecting a textbook American aerial assault. If you fly an MEU in there, those helos will be painted and shot out of the sky by man-portable air defense systems before they cross the horizon line." Commander Gregson swallowed hard, looking nervously at Sterling. "Furthermore," Evelyn said, her eyes finally locking onto Sterling with a predatory intensity, "the sublevels you want to breach with RHIBs? They are rigged with localized, sonar-triggered explosives. Your boats will be blown to pieces before they get within grappling hook distance. Your hammer and anvil is a suicide trap." Sterling was breathing heavily. His entire ego, his career, his authority, was being dismantled in front of the Secretary of the Navy by a woman in an unmarked fleece jacket. He panicked, resorting to the only weapon he had left, his rank. "This is completely fabricated nonsense," Sterling yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're a desk jockey making up ghost stories to sound important. I don't care what delusions of grandeur you have, little girl. You're speaking to an admiral of the United States Navy. I demand to know your rank and command immediately, or I will have the Marines drag you out of here in irons." Evelyn slowly put the laser pointer down. She stood up. The room was so silent you could hear the distant crash of the waves outside the base. She reached for the zipper of her black Arcatrix fleece. "You want my rank, Richard?" she asked softly, using his first name, a massive calculated insult in military protocol. She pulled the zipper down and shoved off the heavy jacket, letting it drop to the back of her chair. Underneath the unmarked fleece, Evelyn wore the standard green and tartan camouflage of the Navy working uniform Type 3. But it wasn't the camouflage that made the oxygen instantly evaporate from the briefing room. It was the heavy, gleaming metal pinned above her left breast pocket, and the stark, undeniable insignia fastened to her collar. There, resting securely over her heart, was the special warfare trident, the Golden Eagle, clutching an anchor, trident, and flintlock pistol. It was worn, slightly tarnished at the edges, bearing the quiet, undeniable authenticity of decades spent in the mud and the blood. And on her collar points, replacing the standard officer bars, sat the solid, heavy silver stars of the Rear Admiral. Sterling's eyes darted from the trident to the silver stars, his brain completely misfiring. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. Commander Gregson, standing just behind him, took a slow, physical step backward, as if trying to merge with the wall. "Rear Admiral Evelyn Hayes," she said, a voice echoing perfectly in the dead silent room. She didn't raise her volume. She didn't need to. "And as of 48 hours ago, by direct executive order of the President and confirmed in closed session by the Senate Intelligence Committee, I am the Fleet Commander of the Joint Special Operations Maritime Task Force." The words Fleet Commander hit Sterling like a physical blow to the sternum. It wasn't just a rank. It was absolute, unmitigated operational control. She wasn't just his equal in stars in this theater under this mandate. She was his direct superior. That is impossible. Sterling stammered, his booming voice reduced to a hollow, reedy rasp. He looked desperately toward Secretary of the Navy David Kessler, seeking a lifeline. "Mr. Secretary, I have not been briefed on any command restructuring." "This woman, this Admiral," Kessler interrupted, his tone instantly dropping to 0 degrees, "is exactly who she says she is, Richard. Admiral Hayes's portfolio is classified above top secret. She's spent the last decade running the Joint Special Operations Command's most sensitive black site operations out of Damne. When the CIA lost their operatives in the Sulu Sea, the Pentagon realized we needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Hayes is the scalpel. She was inserted into Palawan a week ago to run advance force operations while you were still drafting PowerPoint slides." Sterling opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogant veneer had entirely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, obsolete relic of a bygone military era. The man who had just threatened to court-martial her for speaking out of turn was now standing before the absolute apex predator of the naval special warfare community. Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply stepped forward, took the laser pointer from the table, and pointed it back at the digital map of the oil rig. "Now sit down, Richard," Evelyn commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an order from a fleet commander. Sterling sank into his chair as if his knees had been kicked out from under him. He stared blankly at the polished wood of the table. "We are scrapping the Marine Expeditionary Drop," Evelyn addressed the room, her eyes sweeping over the suddenly highly attentive staff officers. "The hammer and anvil is dead. If we wake up that P-18 radar, the hostages die. Instead, we are going completely subsurface." She tapped the control pad, bringing up a bathymetric scan of the ocean floor directly beneath the rig. "The USS Texas, a Virginia-class fast-attack submarine, is currently loitering at a depth of 400 feet, 12 nautical miles out," Evelyn explained, her voice entirely devoid of the drama that had just occurred. "Tonight at 0200, the Texas will launch 2 Mark 11 sealed delivery vehicles, dry combat submersibles. They will carry 24 operators from Devdra's Ren Squadron. They will approach the rig from the blind spot in the sonar-triggered minefield, a narrow trench I mapped out personally during my recon swim." Commander Gregson raised a trembling hand. "Admiral Hayes, ma'am. The lower pylons are heavily guarded. How do the operators breach the sub-level without alerting the guards?" "They don't breach the sub-level doors," Evelyn replied, zooming in on the massive rusted steel columns supporting the rig. "They utilize magnetic scaling gear to climb the inside of the hollow primary exhaust shafts. It's a vertical climb of 80 feet in absolute darkness, carrying 70 pounds of gear. It bypasses the lower decks entirely and puts them directly beneath the reinforced floor of the hostage holding area on the second tier." Kessler leaned forward, thoroughly engaged. "What about the guards in the holding area?" "Water tank-shaped charges on the floorboards." "Simultaneous detonation," Evelyn said. "It blows inward, disabling the hostiles. Our operators swarm up through the breach, secure the CIA personnel, and exfil by base jumping off the eastern edge of the rig into the water, where the SDVs will be waiting for extraction. The entire kinetic phase from the floor breach to hitting the water will take less than 90 seconds. By the time the militia's quick reaction force figures out what happened, our people will be 50 feet underwater, heading back to the Texas." It was a masterclass in modern asymmetrical warfare. It was terrifyingly dangerous, requiring microscopic margins for error, but it neutralized every single advantage the enemy held. "Any questions?" Evelyn asked, looking directly at Sterling. Sterling didn't look up. He just shook his head slightly. "Good," Evelyn said, closing her leather notebook. "Briefing is adjourned. Operations Center goes on lockdown in 1 hour. Let's go to work." The Joint Operations Center, JOC, at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was a sprawling subterranean cavern bathed in the sterile icy blue glow of floor-to-ceiling tactical monitors. At 01:45 hours, the ambient noise in the room had dropped to an absolute minimum. There was only the low, rhythmic hum of the server banks and the hushed, clipped voices of the communications technicians relaying telemetry data. Evelyn stood dead center at the primary command console, a heavy communications headset secured over her right ear. She had shed the unmarked fleece jacket hours ago, now wearing a black tactical polo that offered no hint of her rank, though everyone in the room now knew exactly who she was. Her eyes were locked onto the primary overhead screen, which displayed a high-resolution thermal imaging drone feed circling silently at 30,000 feet above the Sulu Sea. Admiral Richard Sterling sat in a leather swivel chair off to the far side of the room. He hadn't spoken a single word in over 3 hours. He was nominally still present, a 2-star admiral watching a Tier 1 operation, but he had been thoroughly and publicly sidelined. He was now just a ghost in the machine, forced to watch the future of naval warfare unfold without his input, his sledgehammer doctrine replaced by a terrifyingly precise scalpel. "Target package is green," the lead comms technician whispered, his fingers flying across a backlit keyboard. SDVs detaching from the USS Texas, commencing infiltration phase. Evelyn watched the digital telemetry markers on the bathymetric screen. The 2 Mark 11 SEAL delivery vehicles, essentially flooded electric mini-submarines, were moving agonizingly slowly. They were navigating the treacherous, mine-laden trench she had personally mapped out during her covert reconnaissance swim days prior. The tension in the JOC was a physical weight pressing down on the chest of every sailor and officer present. The margin for error was non-existent. If the SDVs brushed a single rusted cable or triggered a localized acoustic anomaly, the ocean would erupt, and 24 of America's most elite Special Mission Unit operators would disappear into the black water in a red mist. Minutes bled into hours. The digital clock on the wall ticked forward. 0215, 0215, 0230, 0245. Evelyn's posture never changed. She was a statue carved from ice, her breathing slow and measured. "Marker 1 to Osprey." A heavily filtered, whispering voice suddenly cracked over Evelyn's headset, breaking the agonizing silence. "We are at the base of the primary chimney. Disembarking submersibles. Commencing the climb." "Copy, Marker 1," Evelyn replied, her voice a calm, flat anchor in the darkness. "Execute." Through the thermal overlay on the main screen, Evelyn watched 24 tiny, heat-blooming dots detach from the waterline of the massive oil rig. Slowly, methodically, they began to ascend the interior of the rig's massive, hollow exhaust columns. They were climbing purely on advanced magnetic grips, inching their way up an 80-foot vertical steel tunnel that smelled of decades-old crude oil and rust. Every muscle in the operators' bodies would be screaming, burdened by 70 pounds of wet gear, weapons, and explosives. A single slip, a single dropped rifle would echo through the hollow metal pipe and alert the guards above. Sterling leaned forward in his chair, sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning of the JOC. This was the part his rigid, conventional military mind couldn't fully comprehend, the sheer, tortuous physical endurance and absolute silent discipline required to pull off such a maneuver. His doctrine relied on loud helicopters, overwhelming suppressive fire, and shock and awe. This was entirely different. These were ghosts moving inside the walls of the enemy's own fortress. Marker 1 is in position directly beneath the target deck. The radio crackled again, the operators breathing perfectly controlled despite the grueling climb. Linear-shaped charges set on the floorboards. "We have audio on the hostiles above us. They are relaxed, unaware." Evelyn checked the mission clock. It was time. "Green light, Marker 1, Evelyn said softly. "Bring them home." On the thermal screen, a brilliant white-hot flash erupted on the second tier of the rig. Even without audio feed in the JOC, the sheer violence of the breach was visually apparent in the real world. Thousands of miles away in the Sulu Sea, the water temp-shaped charges detonated with a muffled, concussive thump that was absorbed by the heavy steel infrastructure. A 10 by 10-foot section of the holding room's floorboards simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a microsecond of directed kinetic energy. Before the Abu Sayyaf guards could even process the noise, let alone raise their rusted AK-47s through the smoke and splintered wood, DevJor operators erupted into the room from the gaping hole in the floor like demons summoned from the deep. Suppressed HK-416 rifles coughed quietly in the choking dust. The double taps sent a mass head. 4 guards dropped to the floor instantly. Their central nervous systems shut down before they realized they were under attack. Chatbot, the radio buzzed urgently. Packages secured. 2 males, 1 female. Battered, malnourished, but breathing and ambulatory. Moving to exfil immediately. Evelyn's eyes darted to the mission clock. 42 seconds had elapsed since the detonation. Hostile QRF is moving from the upper decks, the drone operator called out from the back of the room, his voice rising in pitch. I count at least 20 heavily armed combatants descending the external stairwells. They're moving fast. Let them come, Evelyn said. Her voice didn't waver. On the screen, the operators didn't bother engaging the reinforcing troops or setting up defensive perimeters. That wasn't the mission. Carrying the 3 battered CIA operatives between them, they sprinted to the eastern edge of the rusted deck. Without hesitating, without looking back at the heavily armed militia pouring out of the stairwells, the SEALs launched themselves over the guardrails. They plummeted 70 feet through the humid night air, diving into the dark, churning waters of the Pacific. Splashdown, Muckle 1 reported over the encrypted channel, the sound of rushing water filtering through his mic. We have the packages, loading into the SDVs now. We are subsurface and detaching from the objective. Total time on target, 86 seconds. Up on the rig, the militia's quick reaction force finally kicked in the steel doors to the holding room. They found nothing but dead guards, a blown-open crater in the floor, and empty space. The hastily modified Russian P-18 radar spinning on the roof never registered a single blip. There were no helicopters to shoot down, no incoming boats to shred with heavy machine gun fire. The Americans had come from the deep, surgically excised what belonged to them, and vanished back into the black abyss. Mission accomplished, Admiral, the lead comms tech said, ripping off his headset as a massive collective wave of relieved exhales washed through the operations center. Several junior officers clapped each other on the shoulder. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She didn't cheer, and she didn't smile. She simply nodded, reached forward, and pressed a heavy physical button on her console to secure the satellite feed. She took off her headset and laid it gently on the desk. She turned around and found Secretary of the Navy David Kessler standing directly behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare, genuine smile of profound respect on his face. "Flawless execution, Admiral Hayes," Kessler said quietly, ensuring his voice didn't carry over the celebrating room. "The President has already been notified of the successful extraction. He sends his personal regards. Pass on my thanks to the Commander-in-Chief, Mr. Secretary," Evelyn replied, picking up her battered leather notebook and tucking it under her arm. "But the men in the water did the heavy lifting tonight. I just pointed them in the right direction." Kessler chuckled softly, then turned his gaze toward the far corner of the room. Richard Sterling was slowly standing up from his chair, looking completely defeated. A 2-star admiral looked 10 years older than he had that morning in the briefing room. His immaculate uniform suddenly looked too big for him. "Admiral Sterling," Kessler called out, the warmth instantly vanishing from his voice. Sterling walked over, his posture sagging, his eyes glued to the floor. "Mr. Secretary." Admiral Hayes. He couldn't quite bring himself to meet Evelyn's eyes. The humiliation was absolute. "Your transfer orders have been expedited," Kessler said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy, ringing with the cold reality of Washington politics. "You're being officially reassigned to the Defense Logistics Agency in Omaha, effective immediately. Your command of the Carrier Strike Group is formally terminated as of this minute. You will quietly clear out your office by dawn." If you speak to the press, I will personally ensure your pension is frozen pending a full congressional inquiry into your operational mismanagement." Sterling swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at Evelyn one last time. There was no arrogant rage left in him, only the profound, crushing realization that he was a dinosaur who had tried to hunt a predator he couldn't even comprehend. "Understood, Mr. Secretary," Sterling whispered hoarsely. He turned and walked out of the operations center, his footsteps heavy, the heavy steel doors sealing shut behind him with a definitive hiss. Evelyn didn't watch him leave. She walked past the celebrating technicians, out of the command center, and stepped into the cool pre-dawn Coronado air. The thick, salty fog was rolling off the Pacific, just as it had the morning she arrived. She opened her metal thermos and took a slow sip of the cold black coffee. The military was fundamentally changing, shifting rapidly away from the loud brute force tactics of the past into a silent, shadowy, high-tech future, and Rear Admiral Evelyn Hayes, the ghost of Defterra, the fleet commander who had broken the hardest, most unyielding ceiling in the United States Navy, was exactly where she belonged, standing in the dark, watching over the deep. Did you love this story? The military world is full of incredible hidden legends who break the mold and shatter expectations. If you want to hear more explosive stories of real-life inspired drama and the silent professionals who run the shadows, hit that like button, share this with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales.